count the Space Marines of the Ultramarines. At the height of the Great Crusade, scattered Imperial records and the testimony of surviving legionaries place Guilliman's 13th Legion at approximately 250,000 Astartes, the largest military formation in human history. Other legions fell well short of that figure. The Raven Guard, one of the smallest, stood somewhere near 80,000. An official Games Workshop article confirms that Great Crusade legions numbered at least 100,000 Astartes. The Ultramarines stood at 2.5 times even that confirmed minimum. Their Geneseed, the raw biological currency of the Adeptus Astartes, was described across subsequent centuries as uniquely stable, unusually dominant, and resistant to the mutations that corroded competing bloodlines. More second founding successor chapters were seeded from Guilliman's genetic template, alongside the Dark Angels, than from any other first founding line. In the 41st millennium, the Ultramarines and their descendants account for the dominant share of all Space Marine chapters. Their bloodline, the closest thing the Imperium has to a baseline, a norm, a standard against which deviation is measured. That scale and that stability are the first two pieces of evidence. The third sits in the Imperial Palace on Terra. Malcador the Sigillite, the Emperor's closest counselor, the second most powerful human being alive during the Great Crusade, is depicted in canonical imagery on a throne flanked by two skulls. Each skull bears a number, carved deep into the bone, 2 and 11. Whatever those numbers once meant, whatever faces wore those designations, whatever histories accumulated behind them, the skulls are all that remain. Both legions existed. Both primarchs were found and reunited with their forces during the Great Crusade. Then, at some point before the Horus heresy erupted at Isstvan, both were expunged. That is the word Imperial records use. Not lost, not destroyed in battle. The word used is expunged, and nothing is known for sure about their names, their homeworlds, or the nature of what ended them. 20 Space Marine legions were created. 20 primarchs were found during the Great Crusade. Of those 20, the statues in the Primarch Gallery of the Imperial Palace eventually numbered only 18. The plinths marked 2 and 11 stood empty, not cracked, not toppled, empty, maintained, kept clean, as if the absence itself was being preserved rather than merely acknowledged. The records for both legions were deliberately deleted, not lost to archival damage, not buried under millennia of administrative entropy. The traitor legions are still listed in Imperial catalogs, still named, still catalogued, simply noted as excommunicate traitorous. Whatever the 2nd and 11th did, it wasn't simply treason. Traitors leave records. Enemies are documented. The 2nd and 11th were made into something the Imperium has no proper word for. Absences so deliberate they suggest the records themselves were judged more dangerous than whatever they contained. The surviving primarchs swore an oath to honor the silence. Multiple Horus heresy sources confirm it. The remaining brothers pledged never to speak the lost primarchs' names. Horus reportedly came close to breaking that oath before catching himself. Only Malcador and the Emperor knew the full shape of what lay behind those two expunged lines in the Imperial ledger. In False Gods, Horus experiences a vision inside a Davinite temple while recovering from a near-fatal wound on Davin. The vision deposits him in the Genitor Vault beneath Terra, the chamber where the primarchs were created. He walks past the incubation tanks, row after row. He stops before Tank 11. He reflected on the untapped glories that lay within, knowing they would never come to pass. Then his rage takes him, and he drives his fist through the glass. The vision is chaos orchestrated, its literal truth uncertain, but the detail persists in the text. Something in the 11th's potential was worth marking, worth noting, worth the specific melancholy of a glory that would never arrive. The first heretic is the closest the official canon comes to addressing what happened to the lost Legion's surviving Marines. In a conversation among word-bearers' characters, a rumor surfaces. Around the time the 2nd and 11th Legions were expunged from Imperial records, the Ultramarines' legion swelled in numbers to eclipse every other legion in the Imperium. The implied mechanism is absorption, surviving Marines from the dissolved legions inducted into Guilliman's ranks, their identities subsumed into the 13th's growing mass. One character, Ingethel, dismisses the suggestion as insipid conjecture. In the same breath it stated, Games Workshop has never confirmed the absorption.
It exists in canon as an in-universe rumor, contested by characters who speak it, unsupported by any authorial declaration or codex entry. Ingethel isn't wrong to be skeptical, and yet the Ultramarine numbers need an explanation. The official record notes the growth. It offers no mechanism for it. The absence in the Ultramarine bloodline needs an explanation too. If the 11th Legion's surviving Marines were absorbed into the Ultramarines, and if the 11th Primarch carried a null nature in his Geneseed, then the Ultramarine bloodline should show evidence of that inheritance, somewhere. Across any period in 10,000 years of the most exhaustively documented genetic line in the Imperium, it shows nothing. Not one blank, pariah, or null anomaly confirmed in the Ultramarine bloodline or in any of its hundreds of successor chapters, across any period of the Imperium's recorded history. The absence is the evidence. Understanding why requires understanding what Geneseed actually does. Every Space Marine is made through a sequential process of 19 organ implantations. Each organ corresponds to a specific category of Geneseed, drawn from samples of genetic tissue taken from each of the 20 Primarchs during the Primarch project. The chain of biological transmission is direct. The Emperor used his own genetic material as the foundational base for each Primarch's genome, differentiated 20 distinct strands from that template, and drew the founding Geneseed of each legion from the resulting tissue. The biology isn't metaphorical. The Primarch is the source, the Geneseed is the vector, and the Space Marine is the product. What a Primarch was, encoded in his unique biological inheritance, cascades into every Space Marine produced from his Geneseed template. The process isn't a perfect copy of Primarch biology reproduced at scale. No Space Marine reaches Primarch-level capability. But the predispositions, the tendencies, the anomalous characteristics embedded in a Primarch's genome don't dissolve in the implantation process. They compress into the gene seed, wait in each progenoid gland extracted from a veteran's chest or neck, and express themselves, variably, statistically, across populations and generations, with a persistence that the full span of documented Space Marine history has confirmed without exception. There is a biological law at work in all of that documented history. Established doctrine does not state it as a formally codified principle, but it states the examples, and the examples are consistent across every well-evidenced legion. The Blood Angels are the clearest case. Sanguinius, the angel, gene father of the 9th Legion, carried something hidden in his genotype. Not a flaw inherited from the Emperor's base template, but a deviation specific to his own unique biology, buried deep enough that decades of Great Crusade service passed before it began to surface at a rate that could no longer be managed through quiet individual interventions. his legionaries began experiencing episodes in sustained combat. A craving, an escalating bloodlust that stripped away cognition until nothing remained but the drive to kill and consume. A genetic flaw deeply embedded in the Blood Angel's Geneseed, the red thirst. Fear to Tread, James Swallow's Horus Heresy novel, opens with the moment Sanguinius is forced to acknowledge this openly. One of his blood angels, Elatros, has succumbed beyond the point of return. Horus is present. He watches Sanguinius kill Elatros personally, not in combat, not as punishment, but with the deliberate quiet of a man who has made this specific decision many times before and knows it does not become easier. Horus asks why.
Sanguinius initially refuses to answer. Then, in a passage that carries the weight of everything he has been carrying alone for years, Sanguinius gives him an answer. You know the reason. I won't be responsible for the erasure of the Blood Angels from Imperial history. I won't have a third empty plinth beneath the roof of the hegemon as my legion's only memorial. A third plinth. No ambiguity lives in those words. Sanguinius wasn't reaching for a poetic parallel. He was stating to another Primarch, in explicit terms that only a Primarch who had sworn the oath could fully decode, that he feared a specific institutional consequence, a genetic flaw discovered, evaluated as uncontrollable, and used to justify the deletion of a legion from history. He connected the red thirst, a specific, documented, biological Geneseed flaw, to the fate of the 2nd and 11th. At least one of the lost legions was purged not for treachery, not for chaos corruption, but for what their Geneseed contained. Something heritable, something biological, something that the Imperial apparatus judged too dangerous to allow continuing in the Space Marine bloodlines. That was in the years before Isstvan. The red thirst is still active 10,000 years later. Official Games Workshop publications confirm the flaw appeared during the Great Crusade and has flowed continuously through the Blood Angel's veins since, producing the Death Company, producing the Black Rage, producing the whispered rumors of drained bodies on worlds where the 9th garrison. The Flesh Terrors show it more severely than the parent chapter. The Blood Drinkers, the Angel Sanguine, every chapter carrying Sanguinius's genetic template carries his flaw with the same reliability they carry his winged aesthetic and his blood rituals. Geographically separated by thousands of light years, historically separated by millennia, the flaw does not care. It travels in the Geneseed, and the Geneseed travels in the progenoid glands, and the progenoid glands are extracted and archived and implanted in the next generation of aspirants. And the flaw arrives with them, unchanged. Sanguinius feared that a Primarch's genetic characteristic, once embedded in the Geneseed of a legion, couldn't be excised. He was right. The Space Wolves demonstrate the same biological principle from a different angle. The Canis helix, the genetic mutation distinctive to Leman Russ's 6th Legion, produces canine physiological expressions, dramatically enhanced sensory capabilities, and a near-frenzy aggression that every Space Wolf spends his entire service life fighting to contain. Horus Heresy-era analysis of Primarch genome samples identified the cause. Canine-like sequences embedded in Leman Russ's foundational genome, not present in the base Primarch gene stock. Not a mutation that developed after the fact on the frozen world of Fenris. The helix was woven into Russ's genome from the Primarch project itself, though, whether by deliberate design, a quirk of Russ's nature, or some accident of that early work, canon does not settle. It has expressed in every Space Wolf made from Russ's Geneseed ever since, running continuously from the first Fenrisian recruits who drank from the cup of Wolfen through the long fangs of the 41st millennium, producing fanged teeth, yellowed eyes in veteran warriors, and the ever-present risk of full devolution into the wolfen. The consequences for the 6th's genetic propagation are permanent and documented. When the Space Wolves attempted to create successor chapters during the second founding, the Canis Helix made it impossible. The Wolf Brothers, the lone attempted successor chapter, quickly succumbed to the curse of the wolfen and scattered. The Canis Helix was too dominant in the Geneseed to be safely replicated into a new organizational generation. In the 32nd Millennium, Magnus the Red stormed the Fang and reportedly struck at research aimed at stabilizing the Helix enough to permit successor chapters, destroying that work before pressing on to assault the Fang's heart. He understood the stakes of that research. One Primarch's genetic trait mattered enough to a hostile intelligence that eliminating the work closest to neutralizing it was worth the detour. One Primarch, one genetic trait, one expression that refuses to dilute, refuses to fade, refuses to become silent no matter how many generations pass or how far the bloodline spreads.
This is the biological law governing every documented Geneseed line. A Primarch's distinctive biological inheritance persists in all subsequent generations produced from his template, across millennia, without exception, at statistical rates that can't be eliminated through time or expansion alone. Apply that law to the 11th. A null, called a blank, called a pariah, called an untouchable across different Imperial traditions, is a human being born with a genetic mutation so rare that its natural occurrence rate approaches the practically impossible. The pariah gene. Its biological effect is absolute. Individuals who carry it register as a void in the warp. No psychic signature, no soul presence in the immaterium. An absence so complete, it actively pushes back against the natural fabric of warp space around it, creating a field of psychic nullification that affects everyone in proximity. Humans, space marines, daemons, psychers, at intensities ranging from mild unease to incapacitating agony, depending on the null's individual grade. Walk within range of a low-grade blank, and something in your hindbrain registers wrongness before your conscious mind processes why. An absence where something should be. The wordless biological recognition that humans extend to other humans. The deep social acknowledgement of another person's presence in the world fails to activate. What stands in front of you looks human, moves human, speaks human, but some layer beneath conscious thought knows that nothing is looking back from the warp. It responds the way it responds to deep silence in a space that should have sound, with the cold understanding that something has been removed. A high-grade null is different in kind, not just degree. Psychers describe standing near one as the most profound discomfort they can experience, not of the body, but of existence itself, as if something fundamental to what it means to be a conscious creature in a warp-suffused universe has been switched off in the local vicinity. The Codex Assassins, recruited exclusively from individuals born with the pariah gene, are among the most feared operatives in the Imperium's arsenal. Their reputation among Eldari warlocks, beings with psychic sensitivity orders of magnitude beyond ordinary human capacity, is one of genuine revulsion. The Codex Assassin Draenos, deployed against the sorcerer Xantaka in M32, was effective not primarily through martial skill, but through the simple fact of what he was, a living extinguisher of psychic reality in his immediate vicinity, invisible to the sorcerer's powers because his powers had no surface on which to anchor. The pariah gene is heritable. This is established in Astartes' biological doctrine. It's a genetic mutation individuals are born with, not developed, not acquired, not psychically inflicted.
The Sisters of Silence, who require it as the condition of service, are recruited from populations where the gene appears at higher than background frequency, consistent with transmission through lineage. The Codex Temple has maintained an active program of identifying and redirecting individuals born with the gene since at least the Great Crusade era. Their entire institutional model depends on the pariah gene being a biological inheritance that can be systematically found and directed. A human carrying it passes something heritable on to their descendants. Not a certainty, not a simple dominant recessive mechanism, but a predisposition that surfaces and resurfaces in bloodlines where it has been present before. Now, build the contradiction.
If a Primarch's foundational biology was organized around warp nullification, if the genetic basis of the pariah condition wasn't merely present in his genome but constitutive of his nature as a Primarch, then his Geneseed would carry that biological root into every Marine produced from his template. Not as a separate organ. The pariah gene does not correspond to any of the 19 Space Marine organ types. But Geneseed transmits more than organ templates. It carries the genetic context of its founding Primarch as a shaping influence on how every implanted organ develops and what predispositions express. The Blood Angel's organs are structurally identical to the standard Astartes pattern. The red thirst isn't housed in a unique 19th organ. It's embedded in the genetic context that the Geneseed provides, the surrounding biological signature that tells the organs how to develop and what tendencies to amplify. That is why it persists in successor chapters who have never been to Baal and have never met Sanguinius. A null-primarch's Geneseed would carry his pariah-adjacent genetic context in exactly the same way. Not every Marine produced from it would manifest the full null condition. The pariah gene is rare enough that even in a lineage where it's encoded, expression in any individual is probabilistic. But the predisposition would be present. The genetic context would favor its expression at rates far above any background frequency. Across a sufficiently large population, across a sufficiently long time frame, statistical expression isn't just likely, it becomes inevitable. The Ultramarine bloodline is the largest Space Marine genetic population in the Imperium. Hundreds of successor chapters, potentially half of all the Space Marines who have ever lived since the second founding. 10,000 years of continuous Geneseed production. There are no null anomalies. No confirmed blank, pariah, or untouchable in the Ultramarine bloodline, in any of its successor chapters, across any period of the Imperium's history in which records have been preserved. The logical trap closes on itself. If the pariah gene is heritable, and if Primarch traits persist in Geneseed across millennia without exception, then a null-natured 11th Primarch would leave biological evidence in every generation of Marines descended from his template. The evidence is absent across 10,000 years. Either the absorption is false and the Ultramarine swelling is unexplained, or the null Geneseed was actively and deliberately prevented from expressing itself. Games Workshop has never identified the 11th Primarch. Their identity, their name, their homeworld, their history are all absent from every official publication. The Lost Legions are an intentional creative mystery, preserved as blank space for players to populate with custom chapters. There is no canonical text identifying any Primarch as a null, a blank, or a pariah. The null-primarch is a hypothesis, not a confirmed lore fact, and every argument that follows carries that framing throughout. But the hypothesis must account for all four facts simultaneously. The swelling of the Ultramarines during the 11th's dissolution,
the absence of null anomalies across 10,000 years and hundreds of successor chapters, the canonical heritability of the pariah gene, and the canonical persistence of Primarch traits in Geneseed without documented exception. No other model accounts for all four at once. The quarantine model does. At the point of the 11th Legion's dissolution, confirmed by multiple Horus heresy sources as occurring before the heresy began, Guilliman's force reportedly stood near 250,000 Astartes.
If the 11th surviving Marines numbered somewhere between 10,000 and 20,000 at absorption, a plausible estimate for a legion whose Primarch was expunged before the heresy's attrition, they would have represented roughly 5 to 10% of the resulting Ultramarine mass. 5 to 10% null predisposed Geneseed, absorbed into 90 to 95% of the most genetically stable and dominant template in the Imperium. The dilution arithmetic matters. The pariah gene, even without competition, is extraordinarily rare, described in Adeptus Astartes doctrine as approaching the impossible to reliably cultivate or predict. Against the overwhelming dominance of established ultramarine genetic markers, against a Geneseed so robust it has propagated successfully into more successor chapters than any competing template in existence, the null predisposition would face suppression pressure compounding with every passing generation. The first generation of post-absorption Ultramarines carries the highest proportion of 11th-derived Geneseed context, already diluted by the surrounding mass of ultramarine biology. The progenoid glands extracted from those marines carry the diluted mixture forward. Each successive generation dilutes it further. A few centuries produces a trace. A millennium reduces it to sub-fractional. 10,000 years approaches undetectable, a ghost signature buried under layer after layer of clean ultramarine biology, invisible in any routine Geneseed screening. Statistical suppression isn't total elimination. Even a near-impossible predisposition pushed far into the tail of the distribution still surfaces occasionally across a large enough population. For the quarantine to produce a clean record across 10,000 years and potentially half the Space Marine chapters in existence, passive dilution had to be paired with active removal of any expression that nonetheless surfaced. That requires a system. The Emperor understood this. He was, by every canonical description, the greatest genetic engineer in human history, the being who created 20 Primarchs from his own genetic material, designed 19 distinct gene seed organ types, and shaped specific Primarch genomes in ways that cascaded into every Marine produced from their templates. Horus Heresy-era analysis of Primarch genome samples confirmed that canine sequences in Leman Russ's genome were embedded from the Primarch project itself, present before any exposure to Fenris, though whether this was deliberate Imperial design or something else entirely, the record does not say. He understood the relationship between Primarch genotype and Legion-scale gene seed expression better than any mind that had existed before or since. He also had an established pattern of managing existential problems through structural concealment rather than direct action. The Webway project was hidden from every Primarch. The true nature of chaos was withheld from his sons, with catastrophic consequences the Horus heresy laid bare. The Emperor consistently chose long-game institutional solutions over transparent disclosure when he judged that the knowledge itself was more dangerous than its absence. Assigning the 11th Legion's surviving Marines to the largest, most stable, most genetically dominant legion in existence, framed in the available record as pragmatic military replenishment of losses, is entirely consistent with that pattern. The Ultramarines were the only candidate.
The Space Wolves Geneseed was too unstable to even sustain a single successor chapter. The Blood Angels carried their own Primarch-derived flaw, already under management, and their genetic pool was smaller and more volatile. The Imperial Fists were rigidly organized but smaller in scale. No other Loyalist Legion combined the sheer numerical mass required for dilution with the genetic stability required to systematically outcompete a foreign trait across generations. The Ultramarines' sheer size, as well as the purity and stability of their Geneseed, explicitly cited in canonical sources as the reason they produced more second founding successors than any other legion, was the specific quality that made them the ideal biological containment vessel. Guilliman's legion was chosen because no other legion could have done the same work. Every Codex-compliant Space Marine chapter maintains an apothecarian. Apothecaries are explicitly responsible, by established Astartes doctrine, for monitoring neophytes throughout the implantation process for mutations, instabilities, and flaws in the developing Geneseed organs. Each of the 19 organs is examined at implantation and at intervals throughout the neophyte's development.
The progenoid glands, which form last and are extracted decades later from veterans, are tested for viability before entry into the chapter's Geneseed archive. Visualize the process. Cold instruments and precise examination, the apothecary's narthecium extending toward a neophyte's developing secondary heart, the quiet efficiency of a procedure practiced thousands of times. The vast majority of aspirants proceed normally. Occasionally, one does not. The apothecary notes the deviation. The glands are quarantined. The documentation is filed. No one in the chapter hierarchy questions a routine apothecarian notation. Geneseed instability isn't rare enough to be remarkable. It produces a line in a logbook. Progenoid glands quarantined due to genetic instability. Neophyte removed from training program. No further service indicated. This is what the filtering mechanism looks like in practice, not a conspiracy in any dramatic sense. The ordinary, mandated biological oversight of the Space Marine chapter structure, doing exactly what it was built to do, catching anomalous Geneseed expression before it can propagate, would catch a null predisposition with exactly the same mechanism it uses to catch any other Geneseed flaw. Flag it, quarantine the glands, record it as instability, move on. The apothecarian does not need to know it's operating as a quarantine protocol. It needs only to do its job. But what happens when a Marine passes initial screening and progresses further? When the anomaly surfaces not in a neophyte's implantation failures, but in a veteran's behavior, in a subtle wrongness that the chapter's officers notice before the apothecary does. This is where the Imperium's other institutional mechanisms enter. The Death Watch recruits from all chapters. Formally, the process selects for combat excellence, decades of service, proven capability against Xenos threats, a warrior whose record warrants the honor and burden of serving in the Emperor's Chamber of Vigil. The selection criteria are legitimate and well documented. The chapter releases the Marine with ceremony, marks his service record with distinction, and logs his departure as honorable secondment. A Marine who returns from Death Watch service is the exception, not the rule. Most serve out extensive tours on watch fortresses scattered across the Imperium's boundaries, reporting to watchmasters rather than to their originating chapters, fighting campaigns that are classified at levels the parent chapter never sees. Their deaths in service are recorded. Their equipment is redistributed. Their progenoid glands, if recovered, return to the Death Watch's own apothecarian rather than to the originating chapter's archive. A Marine who dies on a watch fortress while assigned to a kill team on a classified operation in the Halo stars leaves behind, from his chapter's perspective, a service record that ends with honorable transfer and a gland recovery report filed elsewhere. The chapter's Geneseed archive notes only that the progenoid contribution from that bloodline was interrupted by Death Watch service. It does not record what was peculiar about the Marine. It does not record whether the Watchmaster who recruited him was acting on his own initiative or on a quiet instruction from an authority higher than the chapter hierarchy. It records an absence where a gland contribution should have been, and the absence is entirely explainable, and no one reviewing the archive's cumulative record sees anything suspicious in a sporadic pattern of Death Watch selections that happen to occur with slightly elevated frequency among Marines showing behavioral anomalies in apothecarian reports. The Inquisition maintains the deepest reach of all. Its authority to monitor and intervene in Space Marine chapter affairs is established, if contested. Chapters resist inquisitorial oversight vigorously, but the High Lords have mechanisms for applying pressure when they judge it necessary. The Inquisition's close relationships with blank-utilizing organizations are canonical. The Sisters of Silence, the Colexis Temple, the Ordo Hereticus networks that track and catalog pariah gene carriers across the Imperium's population. These institutional connections mean the Inquisition has both the interest and the infrastructure to monitor Geneseed archives for patterns that suggest pariah-predisposed genetic material propagating through Space Marine bloodlines. A Marine quietly elevated to inquisitorial service, seconded to a retinue, attached to an acolyte cell, assigned to operations that keep him away from his originating chapter permanently, leaves behind a chapter record showing a straightforward transfer. Honorable. Unremarkable. The glands weren't recovered due to operational circumstances. The chapter archive shows a line discontinued, a bloodline ending, a note of service that trails off into classified territory with no further entries. Across 10,000 years, across hundreds of successor chapters, across the full breadth of the Ultramarine genetic inheritance, this set of institutional mechanisms operates continuously. The apothecarian catches the earliest expressions. The Death Watch absorbs the veterans who progress further before their anomaly surfaces. The Inquisition handles the exceptions that require more careful management. None of these organizations need a coordinated directive. Each is executing its existing mandate. The result is a Geneseed archive that, examined at any point in the last 10 millennia, shows a bloodline of remarkable purity, because everything that complicated that purity was quietly removed before it could reproduce. The Codex Astartes was written by Guilliman during the time of rebirth, the period of Imperial reformation following the Siege of Terra, when he held the title of Lord Commander of the Imperium, and reorganized the entire Adeptus Astartes from the ruins of the heresy. Its stated purposes are well documented. Prevent another Horus by ensuring no single commander could again accumulate a force sufficient to threaten Terra. Distribute the Loyalist Legion's Geneseed across dozens of smaller autonomous chapters. Provide the organizational framework the new Adeptus Astartes would need to function without Primarch-level leadership. It governs all aspects of chapter organization and battlefield tactics. Its reception among the surviving Primarchs was contentious. The Imperial fists resisted most vocally. Guilliman imposed the document anyway, absorbing the political cost because he judged the structural necessity outweighed the friction. He built the Codex knowing he might not survive to enforce it, and knowing that a structure which required him to survive would eventually fail. He designed something that would function without him. Every chapter size limit, every organizational hierarchy, every provision for apothecary roles and Geneseed monitoring is embedded in the same document as the tactical doctrines and administrative frameworks.
The genetic monitoring apparatus is indistinguishable from the broader bureaucratic machinery. There is no section of the Codex Astartes titled Suppression of Null Geneseed. There does not need to be.
The existing chapter management framework performs the suppression automatically, because the Codex requires every Codex-compliant chapter to maintain the system that does the suppressing, every generation, indefinitely. Chapters that deviate from Codex provisions are categorized as aberrants. Chapters whose Geneseed quirks or stubbornness lead them to eschew the Codex's organizational requirements are positioned outside the Ultramarine genetic norm. The Codex's definition of compliance is simultaneously a definition of genetic acceptability. To be Codex compliant is to maintain the monitoring systems that keep the chapter's Geneseed record clean. To deviate from compliance is to risk losing the institutional cover that makes the clean record meaningful. Guilliman was the most analytically gifted of the Primarchs, a natural-born strategist, statesman, and warrior in every canonical characterization, and the one Primarch consistently described as thinking in terms of institutional permanence rather than immediate outcomes. He had access to the Emperor's records during the period when those records were still coherent. He ran his own chapter's apothecarian through the years immediately following the 11th's reported absorption. If the absorbed Marines' Geneseed lines were producing anomalous results in those first decades, those results would have appeared in the Ultramarine chapter's own biological documentation. A trait expressing at anomalous frequency in a specific subset of Marines, traceable to a specific intake of recruits drawn from the absorbed Legion survivors, carrying a biological signature unlike anything in the standard Ultramarine Geneseed record, tells a careful observer exactly what the founding Primarch of that Geneseed line was. The Codex Astartes was written after those observations. Robute Guilliman returned to consciousness in the 41st millennium. 10,000 years had passed. He woke to an Imperium mired in its own religious corruption, its administrative institutions failing, its wars against chaos escalating beyond any sustainable scale. The galaxy itself was splitting, the cicatrix maledictum tearing through warp space and real space simultaneously, severing communication and supply lines across an uncrossable psychic wound that ran the length of the known galaxy. Guilliman had built something intended to last. He woke to find it had lasted, technically, while rotting from within in almost every way that mattered. The strategic documents were maintained, the chapter structures were preserved, the apothecarian provisions were still in the Codex, the Geneseed monitoring was still running, the records were still clean, and the Imperium was dying anyway. His canonical response from the Dark Imperium era: "Why do I still live? What more do you want of me? Better that we had all burned in the fires of Horus's ambition than lived to see this." That isn't a general expression of despair. It's a precise statement from a man who understands in full the cost of everything he has built and everything he has buried. He returned remembering every institutional decision made in the post-heresy period, every document written, every system designed to run without him, including the one that had been running unsupervised across centuries he spent on the floor of Macragge in stasis. The system worked exactly as designed. He woke to find it had. The oath of silence around the lost Primarchs held for 10,000 years. The surviving Primarchs who swore it honored it until they were incapable of breaking it, dead like Malcador, who took his numbered skulls and his secrets to the Golden Throne, absent like Jagatai and Vulcan and the other missing loyal Primarchs, or trapped in the specific institutional weight Guilliman carries,
returning to a universe in which the oath is still the only protection the secret has left. The first heretic records Argel Tal's assessment of the 11th Primarch. Killing him in his infancy would have unwritten a shameful future. The word matters. Shame in the Imperium isn't the same as heresy. The 9 traitor Primarchs aren't shamed. They are condemned, catalogued, and commemorated as theological enemies. Shame belongs to things that undermine the institution without offering the consolation of a clear ideological enemy.
A Primarch whose nature was fundamentally warp null. In an Imperium whose entire psychic infrastructure runs on warp-sensitive humanity, whose navigators guide ships through the immaterium, whose astropaths relay communications across a galaxy-wide civilization, whose librarians and sanctioned psychers form the nervous system of human civilization at every level, would be an institutional vulnerability of a specific and quiet kind. Not a traitor, something more unsettling, a genetic inheritance that, if allowed to propagate freely through the Space Marine bloodlines, would produce warriors whose existence quietly complicated the very mechanisms on which the Imperium depended to hold itself together. The name is gone. The plinths are empty. The numbered skulls sit on Malcador's throne and memorialize nothing the historical record is permitted to contain. The Ultramarines are celebrated across the Imperium as the Template Legion. Their genetic stability is foundational to their institutional prestige. Their bloodline is the most widely reproduced Space Marine heritage in existence, a genetic baseline so dominant that Codex compliant means, in biological terms, compatible with the Ultramarine standard. That reputation is the quarantine's greatest sustained achievement. The cleanest bloodline in the Imperium became clean by absorbing something that couldn't be allowed to propagate, held in a vessel large enough and stable enough to suppress it across the full span of the Imperium's history. The stability is real. The purity was maintained. The apothecarian reports were filed. The progenoid glands were quarantined. The Death Watch transfers were processed. The Geneseed archives were kept clean, generation after generation, across every successor chapter, across 10,000 years. None of this is confirmed by Games Workshop. The null-primarch is a hypothesis. The Absorption is an in-universe rumor dismissed in the same novel that states it. The official archives remain sealed, and the creative silence around the Lost Legions is deliberate and sustained. What follows is a deduction from available evidence, not a declaration from closed archives. But the gap in the official record has exactly one shape. The Ultramarines grew when the 11th was dissolved. No null anomalies followed across 10,000 years and potentially hundreds of successor chapters. The pariah gene is heritable by explicit Astartes biological doctrine. Primarch genetic traits express in their legions without exception across all documented history. The red thirst for 10,000 years, the Canis helix across an entire great company, the wolfen waiting inside every space wolf who has ever lived. One absence in all of that persistence. One bloodline that absorbed a dissolved legion and produced no genetic echo of what that legion's Primarch was. An absence maintained not by chance, not by statistical unlikelihood alone, but by 10,000 years of quiet apothecarian work, Death Watch selections, Codex provisions, and institutional machinery that runs too smoothly to attract attention and leaves too little record to be audited. When Guilliman looks at the Imperium he returned to and says he wishes they had all burned, he is speaking from inside a specific knowledge. He knows what his legion's bloodline contains.
He knows what the Codex Astartes was built to do alongside everything it was publicly built to do. He knows the system has been running without him for 10,000 years, and that the Geneseed records are still clean, and he knows precisely what that means about the 10,000 years of quiet filtering that produced that result. He built a machine. It ran. The secret it was built to keep is still kept. The Codex Astartes is the most influential military document in the Imperium's history.
It governs the organization, tactics, genetic monitoring, and chapter structure of the Adeptus Astartes across the breadth of the known galaxy. It's also the lid on a genetic grave. Every Ultramarine who has ever bled for the Imperium, every battle brother in every Codex-compliant chapter tracing genetic lineage to Robute Guilliman, carries, in the deepest and most diluted layer of his biology, the suppressed ghost of a primarch whose name Malcador the Sigillite took to his death marked on bone. The 11th Legion wasn't destroyed. It wasn't erased. It was dissolved, molecule by molecule, generation by generation, apothecarian report by apothecarian report, into the most celebrated bloodline in the Imperium's history. And Guilliman knows. He has always known. Subscribe for more stories like this.